I am guessing, okay, excuse me. Okay, I'm guessing that there are some folks in the group for which this is a real new concept, the concept of active learning. Please ask questions that you have, comments, whatever, through the chat feature. And then others may have already had a lot of experience with the benefits of the active learning approach. And please offer your ideas and your experiences also through the chat feature. And what we'll try to do is take periodic breaks to address comments, questions, and ideas that you care to share. This morning, we're going to set up kind of the background of things. Basically, the first section, which will be about 55 minutes long, we'll kind of look at who Dr. Lilli Nielsen is, what the active learning approach is, and then look at some equipment and materials that can be used to implement that approach. The second section, just so we can look ahead, will be about from after our first break, will be about 10 o'clock for another 55 minutes, kind of looking at how we need to shift our thinking a little bit when we're working with this given population and some of the guiding principles of active learning, and mostly looking at how we can use effective, respectful interaction strategies that tie greatly in with Lilli Nielsen's active learning philosophy, and then kind of look at how we plan activities, observe behaviors, and document progress, which is often a very important part if you're working in an educational system. The last section then will be a more of a practical application. This trying to cover early exploration, early communication, and early literacy in 1 3-hour period of time was kind of monumental, but I think we can do a sampling of some practical applications so you can see some kids in action and at least plant the seed for how you could go about implementing, depending on what role or roles you play, early exploration, early communication, early literacy. And we will talk about how those are really all interlinked anyway in the earliest developmental years. Okay, so let's go ahead and get started with Dr. Lilli Nielsen. The picture here, presented here, is a picture of Dr. Lilli Nielsen in her older years. Dr. Nielsen was born in 1926. She passed away in 2013 at 86 years old. She was born in Denmark, and she was the second of 7 children. 4 of her siblings were blind, and from what I read, when she was 7 years old, she was put in charge to care for her younger brother. So she had a lot of hands-on experience with children who are blind or visually impaired, and I'm assuming they had additional disabilities as well. Lilli started out as a preschool teacher, and then she went on to become a psychologist. She earned a PhD, and her research was the start of her development of the active learning approach. She then took a job as the special education advisor with the National Institute to Blind and Partially Sighted Children and Youth in Denmark. And that is where she remained for the remainder of her career. So the biggest chunk of her career, she served in that capacity. She also traveled internationally to conduct trainings. I don't know if any of you had the opportunity to see her in person, but she was quite a character. She was a very strong woman, and she had some very specific ideas about what things work and about her approach. She was awesome. She also authored a series of books which were based on her dissertation and her life experiences, which gave the background and the reasoning for her approach, her active learning approach. And those can be found at this LilliWorks website that is cited here, www.lilliworks.org. She also developed a kind of a whole series of specialized equipment that she had used with children over the years and that she wanted to have made available to individuals who were working with children in the field. So let's take a peek next at some of those pieces of equipment. The first one pictured here is the little room. And it's kind of exactly as it sounds. It is kind of more like a box, that has an open front. It also has a ceiling. So it has 3 walls. It has usually a plexiglass ceiling on top, and then an open front in which children can enter this little room. Usually there are holes drilled in the top in the plexiglass, kind of in different areas around the top of the box, so that elastic bands can be slid up through the holes. And you'll see in a little bit when you see some of these in action, but then they're anchored at the top. That way, things that are dangling down, which is exactly what's going on in this box, all sorts of different tactile materials and things that dangle down that kids can find when they're in the little room, can be moved around or removed totally without a whole lot of having to take things apart. This little room also has items anchored onto the side walls so that children may also find that. And we'll talk a little bit about the whole array of materials that you can put in a little room and use for the active learning approach. But some of the things here, brushes and different things like that, are one of those. This box, or this little room, sorry, is large enough for a young child to lie down in or sit up in. There are other styles where the roof has been extended up so that a child could actually stand in one, in a stander, or just fully stand and walk in and out of it. So there are various kind of different ones that have been adapted. Okay. The next one is the HOPS address. Pictured here is a little guy, probably, I don't know, maybe 4 years old or so, who is standing upright with the support of what's called the HOPS address. And basically that is a canvas body sling that fits around a child's body, kind of goes between his or her legs, and then supports a child's body. It is at the top, which you cannot see from this picture. At the top is a horizontal bar, and the horizontal bar has the ability to be hooked up by a toggle, some kind of a string or a cable to the ceiling up above. So it is a freestanding type of thing that allows a child who is unable to stand up unsupported to be able to assume an upright position. And some people will put these also on a kind of a slide so that children are able to actually move around. And you will see some examples of that as we go throughout the morning. In the front of the HOPS address are anchored some beads and some other tactile activities, because there is a patch of Velcro that goes across the child's tummy basically, and things can be anchored onto the front, which he or she can find with their hands. The next one is the resonance board. A resonance board is really a wooden platform, and it is a rather large piece, because in this picture here, we have a little boy and his mom both sitting on the resonance board, and it is big enough for both of them, plus some toys. This little guy is taking some plates, plastic plates is what it looks like, and stringing them onto a tube, kind of a post, kind of like a stacking ring, but he is using some real plates that have had holes cut in them. And he and his mom are sitting on this platform. The resonance board usually is raised up about 1 inch. So there is a thin layer of plywood, and then there is a thicker piece of wood that goes all around the edge of the resonance board that actually raises it up. The purpose of the resonance board is to provide a child with extra vibratory information. So when they are moving around on it or sitting on it, bouncing on it or whatever, that it gives a child a lot more feedback from their body and about what's going on. It also serves as a nice hard surface. If a child, for example, if this little guy were to drop one of these plastic plates, he would get a lot more sound feedback from it than if it were on the carpeted floor, which is underneath this resonance board. The resonance board is used in many different ways. It can be used for playing on. It can be used actually underneath in the little room. It can be used in many, many different ways. And the next one is the ESF board. This one is kind of an interesting looking piece of equipment. It has two pieces of thicker plywood, one on top and one on the bottom. Approximately, let's just say about 2 feet long and 1 foot wide. And the bottom one that sits on the floor and the top one above it are connected by what look like bed springs. So there are about 6 bed springs, 3 on each side of the bottom and the top that connect them. So if you kind of get the idea, if a child is to sit on it, it creates a bouncy effect. It kind of throws a child's balance off a little bit, but children can sit on this. They can often lay on their tummies on this or their backs. And some children, if they hold on to something, can actually stand on it. I use this a lot with children out on a playground in a preschool program that I had when they did not have equipment that was really appropriate for the children that I was responsible for. And we were able to bring this out, and actually there was enough room for 2 kids to actually sit on it and play together. Let me see if there's a picture. Okay, the support bench I'm going to just mention, but we can leave it right here, please. The support bench somehow did not get included, but you will see that piece of equipment a little bit later. But let me just explain a little bit about that, because that'll be the final piece of equipment that we'll talk about. The support bench is a wooden platform with sides on it that is connected to a metal frame. Some of the support benches have wheels on them. So a child can be laid over this little platform and could actually push with their feet and move around. But some are stationary. And you will see in a little bit, actually in a few minutes here, Jack's progression videotape. We'll see some of this equipment actually in action, including the support bench. What I'd like you to do is, after we look at this video clip, if you can please just chat if you have observations or questions or anything that you would like to offer that you use some of the equipment with, that would be great. And so, but let's go ahead and take a look at the video, Jack's progression, which has one little boy who kind of progressed from the beginning, which you'll see him on the resonance board, to then being able to progress to other types of equipment and other skill levels. Are we good with the videotape? Thank you.
A title reads, Jack's progression. Jack lies on his stomach on a resonance board. A bead curtain hangs over his midsection. Jack lifts his head slightly and wiggles the fingers on his right hand. Video segment. Jack lies on his stomach on a support bench, with his hands in a tub of water with stones, and his feet in a tub of dirt with pine cones. He moves the stones in the water. He brings his right hand to his mouth before returning it to the stones in the water. New video segment. Jack lies on his back on a mat with chimes suspended above him. He moves the chimes with his right hand while wiggling his feet and toes. New video segment. Jack lies on his back in a little room with objects suspended over his upper body and feet. Using both hands, he bats at objects and grasps a large wooden castanet. He wiggles his toes and feet. New video segment. Jack is positioned upright in a hopsa dress. Beneath his bare feet is a tub of large plastic pegs and a tub of dry rice. Attached to the waist of the hopsa dress are strings of beads and a large piece of aluminum foil. Jack briefly touches the rice and beads with his feet. He shakes a string of beads with his right hand. Jack pivots with his right foot in the tub of pegs. New video segment.
Okay,
Jack
let's
lies
please
on a
stop there.
floor at home. He wiggles and stomps
And
his
for the
feet.
sake of time, we will now go ahead and were there, Kristen, were there any chat questions, comments, things like that that we should stop and talk about?
Nope, there are no questions in the chat.
Okay.
If anyone has a question, let us know now or we'll move on.
Okay, all right. I just wanted to make a couple of observation comments about what you saw as well, about the various pieces of equipment. Using the different pieces of equipment as a child is physically ready to do them varies a child's position in which they are exploring the environment and experiencing the environment, which is really an important idea for orientation mobility. It gets kids upright. As I mentioned with the HOPS address, many times people will use a track to put that on so kids can actually move themselves through space and find different things along the way. One thing they didn't mention too was the vocalizations that occur, especially when there is a ceiling, like in the little room. You are often going to hear kids vocalizing a lot more because they're getting more feedback for what they're doing if they have the ability to hear that vocal feedback. And it's a really kind of neat thing to kind of see that happening. Also, vocalizations occurred with Jack when he was upright and he was exploring. He kind of emitted some kinds of vocalizations, which then can actually, now they were leaving him alone, and we'll talk a little bit about that. This was not an interactive type of experience with the pieces of equipment, but more of a free-flowing, don't interrupt type experience that you often will start with, and then it can expand into some other kinds of things. Positioning of the items is really important. And you looked at Jack, at first they kind of had everything right around his head and his hands, but they put special attention to putting things down by his feet, because obviously he had a lot of movement and interaction with his feet as well. So paying attention to sort of where things were placed will kind of help with the success that a child has with interacting and finding a lot of the objects there. Okay, back to our slides. Let's
And this
take
is
a look.
Kristen. I just
Yes.
want to let everyone know that the videos are available in the Google folder, and you can purchase these things on the Lilli Works site, and I put the link in the chat.
Thank you. Thank you, Kristen. Okay, so active learning materials. Let's kind of look at, you saw some examples of some of the things that were used in the video clips that you saw. And basically, Lilli Nielsen really insisted that most of them be everyday items from around home. If you think about it, that kind of makes sense because they're the types of things that kids will contact in their everyday life, so that makes sense. They're also things that offer sensory experiences that a lot of toys don't. If you look at our toys nowadays, most of them are molded plastic with very little other sensory qualities. So active learning materials will provide interesting sensory qualities that you may not find other places. Things like scratchy surfaces, bristly curlers, musical instruments that provide interesting auditory stuff, and then things that are highly reactive. For example, that crunchy plastic paper, a string of beads, things like that, that with a very little hit or touch or a turn of the head, you can actually get some sound or some reflective things going. So that is really the idea, that you look for everyday items as much as possible with very interesting and varied sensory qualities and that are highly reactive. So let's look now at a video in which a person from the National Deafblind Center talks about kind of the categories and a whole variety of things. And then we'll follow that with looking at kind of the top 5 of my kids' favorites that don't necessarily appear in the video. So we're ready for the video whenever.
The diversity and variety of materials and input possibilities are what you're really looking for anytime you're going to put some materials together for deafblind children, whether it's in books or in the little room or on a tactile book.
We hope the following samples help trigger a few ideas based on the child's likes and strongest sensory input channel.
The magnetic, the advantage is, of course, you've got that feel of when you're pulling it away, and that feel, that give and take is great. Also, you want to look for the colors, whether or not there's some contrast. The metal, of course, has it's the temperature, the coolness of it. It's also shiny. It also has more weight to it than some of the other items, and that's very helpful to some children. Some children really like things that are heavy. Rubber items, and these are just a few. Once again, you're looking at things that they can actually change by pushing it. They can actually change the shape of things. That's another thing that actively they're doing. They can pull them apart. You can squish them and make them go in. So and they don't make a lot of sound. There's a muteness to the sound, which is also has another quality to it. And then soft materials, there's all kinds of soft materials, and you'll find some students who really prefer soft items. So start to look at, well, if the child likes something soft and furry, could we go to something soft and net-like? Could we go to something soft like terry cloth? So start looking at different kinds of materials. Then wooden items. Those are trickier to find in some places, but I'm always looking for wooden items. You have to be careful, though, that you don't get something that's going to easily splinter. But that's, once again, a texture and a touch feel to it that children are going to come into contact with frequently. And then plastic, it's easy to find things made of plastic. Typically, they have more bright colors to them. However, make sure that you're looking for a nice variety of all these textures when you're putting something together. These are what I call stringy items, and often I use these for children either who have very little hands, so we're talking about babies, or children that may not have good fine motor coordination, use of their hands. So what's very nice is their hands will go in here and fingers can get like stuck, feel the texture, which is very nice and very important. Grasping onto something big and round may not be possible for the child, but getting their fingers in and holding and pulling is. So this is just pom-pom, so you can see some of these are very bright, some have reflective qualities, some are smaller and have a different feel to them, some are stringy, almost hair-like. This is called a string thing. All it is a piece of elastic with beads and buttons in between it so that the child can actually pull it as well as run their hand down it. And then everyday functional items. Make sure that you include things that that child may or potentially could come into contact with within the living environment. And make sure that you look for textures that are different, such as the wood versus the plastic, versus the brush bristle feel, versus the metal of the measuring spoons. And then a spoon for feeding oneself, and a cup to drink out of, and measuring cups, and the toothbrush. Look for those items that the child is coming into contact with that he could learn to play with before you have expectations that he's going to be able to use them appropriately. Also, you want to take a look at the items that have some kind of odor or fragrance, and thinking about different kinds of hand cream that have different fragrances. You can put things that have fragrance in little pieces of net and hang them from the little room, or put them on tactile books. One thing you want to be very cautious about when you start working with fragrances is you want to be very cautious about the issue of children's allergies and reactions to them. For some students with limited vision, bright and shiny items are particularly ones that they are attracted to. So these are just some simple examples of ways that you can take advantage of using bright and shiny things. Noticing too the different kinds of materials things are made of, the metal, the coldness of it. Also the shininess, the fact that a child could run their hands or fingers through it. They wouldn't need to have a good solid grasp. The rain ball is bright, but also it takes you into the issue of things that make sound. And then books that have reflective materials in them, like this book, that you can get at almost any store nowadays for various topics. So speaking of sound, let's talk about things that make sound. Okay, here's some items that make sound. Knowing also what frequency sounds the student that you're working with prefers, like things that have a higher frequency sound to them versus a drum that has a much deeper sound. Things that vibrate sometimes also will have auditory sound to it. So some of these items you can see have more than one quality to them. And the clappers, as you're familiar with, once again, something just adding a jingle bell to a chain. So once again, that child who doesn't have good hand grasp use or slightly can get it. Trying to see whether or not a child might follow visually some items. Once again, the rain stick has that sound quality. And then also toys, unusual novel toys like this one that makes a sound. And one sense that seems to be particularly preferred by many children who are deafblind is the vibratory ones. And this is what we think of when we think of vibration. We think of something that has a battery operation to it. You can feel it, it vibrates. That is vibratory, but there are also other ways to get to vibratory too. Anytime you're running your hand down something that has a pattern to it, a textural pattern to it, that also becomes vibratory. So this cardboard, if I'm running my fingers back and forth, there's a vibratory quality in that. With this little turtle string, once again, it's vibratory in that it's got a consistent pattern to it as you go ahead and feel along it. And then, of course, there are other toys that you can often find that have other vibratory qualities too. So don't get yourself locked into the idea that only things that have batteries are therefore vibratory. Just even this, because of the coils on it, has a vibratory quality.
Please do not limit yourselves to what we've shown you. Remember to think out of the box and to focus on the child's likes and strongest sensory input channel.
And that child who doesn't have good
Okay, again, I'm not sure if we had any comments from the group or questions. If not, we'll move along here. One thing that I would like to add, Kristen, did we have any chats? Are we good?
We're good. There were no questions.
Very quiet group today. Okay, that's fine. One thing I wanted to add to the fragrance part, which I have found to be really effective. And again, you have to know that kids are not allergic to certain things, but is to actually use fresh fruits. You can actually hang, let's say, a puncture an orange and hang that orange. You get a wonderful smell, a wonderful texture, the heaviness of it, for example, and then it is a real item if a child is eating, which many of our children do not eat, they're tube fed, but they are experiencing the types of smells that they may smell in their own kitchen. Okay, what I'd like to do now, if there aren't any other questions about that nice overview of the types of materials, is to show you a little bit the Hold Everything booklet, which you see pictured here on the screen is the Hold Everything booklet. I have one here. This is a kind of, people have taken Lilli Nielsen's thoughts and ideas and have often adapted those things. And that was one of my charges when I started working with children, was to make these materials and make the pieces of equipment more accessible to families. So what I tried to do was to gather a lot of ideas of things that could be made from things at home. A little room, for example, although the wooden one is probably much sturdier and it is much more reactive perhaps, but I found that a cardboard box with an opening and a cut in the top with a piece of plexiglass put on top actually did a real similar thing. So I compiled a lot of ideas and put them in this Hold Everything booklet, which is a free download from the Ohio Center for Deafblind Education. And that is at www.ohiodeafblind.com. So some of the things I'm going to show you next are things that were particular favorites, and you might see some of these things. We're not yet to the bigger picture. I'm going to stop here just a second, and I want to show you a few items that I have used with my kids that really turned out to be great kinds of things. You did see spoons that were used and attached, but what I did here was to kind of make sure we had a whole bunch of spoons, which turn out to sound a lot like wind chimes for kids who are able to hear the sound. It has a nice shiny quality for those kids who are able to pick up, light, throwing the light and stuff like that. In this case, there are two sizes of spoons, and we're going to talk about comparables pretty soon, but the kids then can compare a larger spoon with a smaller spoon, both the bowl of the spoon and the length of the spoon. One of the guys that when I was working with a preschool program early on, a little guy came in with his mom, and he was being assessed for entry into the preschool program. And one of his mom's greatest frustrations was that at the age of 3, he was not yet willing to grasp a spoon, or he didn't really understand about the spoon, but he just really refused to do anything with a spoon in terms of eating with a spoon. And mom was frustrated, and that was one of her major goals. So we thought maybe we would just start out while he was playing around, just walking around the room. He was ambulatory. And we attached this string of spoons. They had a door in the back that had a push bar to open it. Now the door was locked, but it had a nice push bar. So we attached this string of spoons to the push bar. The sun was coming in through the window of this door, and it just illuminated these spoons. And he loved the light. He was able to see light, and he walked across the room toward the light and was kind of tapping on the window, and eventually made his way to finding the spoons that were hanging on this door handle all by himself. And he jingled them and he played with them, and he kind of, and after about 20 to 25 minutes of kind of interacting with these, we saw an action where he actually picked one of the spoons out and put it into his mouth. Now, sometimes you think, okay, well, that was great. And that really was an aha moment for mom. And that was an aha moment for us, knowing that sometimes if kids have a chance on their own time without something being forced on them, but they can be introduced to something in a playful way and in kind of a non-structured way, that sometimes that will turn out to be something that kids then will be willing to and will kind of figure out how that then can transfer to something much more meaningful, such as using the spoon to scoop and put it into his or her mouth. The next one that I'm going to show you is, if you can see this, I'll explain it too. This is a stove pan for the old types of stoves that have the metal, round metal pan that goes in case there's a spill, it collects the spill. And you can still purchase these in, at Walmart or in many, many stores. And so this one right here is just one of those metal stove pans. And there is a hole at the top in which you can string a piece of elastic through, and you can attach a string of these, happen to be red metallic beads. And so they make a sound when you shake them, and they throw a lot of good light. Depending on a child's preference, you could choose to use, they have silver ones, there are gold ones, there are red ones, green, all different colors. So this can be mixed up. But this was sort of like what was talked about in the video, one of those things that are easily, a child's hand can easily get kind of caught in without having to have a full grasp, but they can use it and then can shake it. The one warning about this is, and I saw this start to happen, is if a child is really starting to shake this thing, it can come back and hit a child in the head. So you have to be a little careful for safety reasons to either have it up far enough, the pan itself, or to have it far enough away that they can still reach it, but they're not bringing the pan back and accidentally hitting themselves in the head. But this has turned out to be amazing. The pan itself is also very shiny, and a lot of kids really love to see the activity going on, and if they have vision, and to hear the sounds if they have some hearing. Another one, and this I actually made out of two disposable loaf pans, but you can make this, it's metallic, and you can make this out of pot pie tins. That's kind of how I started, or larger pie tins if you want a larger target. This is what I happen to have around my house at the time, were these loaf pans. And what I've done here is taken two loaf pans, and I started out the inside. Now, the problem you run into is you have to be very careful, of course, if you're putting things like bells or, let's say, rice or other kinds of sound making things inside, that none of those a child will be able to get out of there and ingest, because those, of course, could be choking hazards. So one idea for a lot of this is to take a Ziploc baggie and put it inside and just tape the baggie down. So you're still going to get the sound if a child hits it and is able to hear the sound, but you don't have to worry if by some chance that the bells are going to get loose individually and a child is going to actually put it in his or her mouth and choke on it. So once you have that inside and you poke a hole in another one in the top before you close this up, and you string a piece of elastic through, and on the other side, I knotted the elastic and then taped it, probably with like mailing tape or something very strong so that it will stay. Then you put the two hands together, whatever form you have. I have sometimes kind of sewn them together with yarn, sometimes tape them together. And again, anytime a child is using any of these homemade things, you should watch carefully just to be sure that everything is okay. I've had some children who really bite down very hard. This may not be the best option for them because this is something that can be dented and pieces could be pulled off if they have a very strong bite. But this has really turned out to be kind of an interesting and a fun thing for a lot of children. In the earliest years, we know for children who have some usable vision that faces are very important to them, and they tend to gravitate toward looking at faces. So what I did is found some of these little face plates. If you've seen them in stores, they used to sell them in Walmart, and I tried to find that brand recently and I couldn't, but online I was able to find these, which work perfectly as well. And they do come in different colors and different animals. So what I did with this is I took the two plates and I back-to-back them, so it's kind of 3D that way. And you just glue them real carefully and strongly together. And then at the top, you can puncture a hole straight through, run your elastic through. And in this one, I also added a bell for children who have some hearing because it adds a little interest when they're batting it and that type of thing. And this one is another way to kind of, and as it turns around, you're getting some different colors and some different patterns as kids are batting and playing with it. Again, would have to be a little careful with children, either that you toggle it up high enough where they can't bring it to their mouth, or that they're not children who would be biting off a piece, because of course that would be possible with this type of a toy. But this is a really turned out to be fantastic. Another spin on that idea is to simply
Kate,
take,
this is Kristen.
yes.
We did have a comment earlier on, just talking
Yes.
about how giving the students the opportunity to just happen upon the items on their own.
Yes.
And also the possibilities of using hot glue, maybe to glue things together.
Mhm.
And I also want to remind you that we're going to take a break in 5 minutes.
Okay, all right, great. And we're just on time schedule. Thank you very much for the comments from the crowd. That's really appreciated. And I really welcome that, because we can all learn and we can all share things. Just a couple more things here. This was with two just paper plates. The cardboard ones, the real firm ones, are probably best, but you can also put these together. And again, you can do with the hot glue or any kind of a thing, whatever would put these together. You can do the same thing, add bells or other sound making things inside these. And on these, you can actually draw a simple face or put other kinds of patterns on these. And I'm going to show you one pattern that I've used with the next item, but this is really simple. And again, many families have a couple of white paper plates in their cupboard that can be immediately used if you have just some string or elastic or something that you can suspend this from. And the last one, because we are getting close to break, that I'd like to share with you is this. It's actually a box. This one happens to be a rectangular box, and I often will use a little bit smaller square box. This has been one of the neatest things. Again, this creates a nice pattern. And what you have here, I did the same thing as I showed you with the other two, the metallic one and the paper plate. I actually put bells inside of this and attach them, and then close the box. They have the lid and the top and the bottom. And then the stripes here are created by electrical tape. And all you have to do is just go around one way, and then you go around the other way, and it really secures the box closed, and it makes a wonderful, wonderful pattern when it spins around. And it's a very nice way for kids, particularly who are reacting more to black and white than they are to colors. And if there are no questions about those, that's just a couple of ideas. Oh, and you know, with the spoon one too, you can also include a child's own spoon in the mix of this string of spoons, so they could actually find the one that they are being fed with, or that they actually are feeding themselves with. To wrap up our first session here, let's go to the next slide, please, and look at the bigger picture. In reality, the active learning approach really doesn't always need to involve equipment. And in fact, many, many times it doesn't involve actual equipment. And it is more of a philosophy. And that philosophy is, in a broader sense, is for any approach that enables a child's active engagement in their own learning. So we will talk in our next segment about how we can kind of make that happen. We know that the children that we are talking about as the kind of the target population, which we'll define a little more clearly, are children who often need a lot of physical assistance in order to do things, to move around, change their diapers, do regular routine things, but also to find things that are out in their world. And there are some ways that we can look at this without being intrusive on our children's bodies or controlling our children's bodies, and helping them to engage in their own learning in their own way. And much like the feedback from the person in the group, letting them really kind of find their own way, as long as we have the environment structured so that it is an accessible environment for them, we can really allow them and encourage them to figure out what works for them. So I think we are just about correct at our break time. Okay.
Yes, this is Kristen. Thank you so much, Kay. The Dollar Tree is our friend.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Yeah.
And the only caution would be to just look carefully. And I think they talked about this in the video, and everybody kind of knows if you're working with young children, to just watch for the safety factor, things that aren't going to be pulled apart or aren't going to be put into a mouth or whatever. So, but the Dollar Tree, somebody says, do you mean the $1.25 tree? Yes, it is, but still that's a good source. So, yes, so thank you for your attention in this first section. And Kristen, you want to continue and finish off?
We'll take a 5-minute break and come back at 10 o'clock.
Thank you, Kristen. And I agree, please, those of you particularly who have been doing this for a while have probably come up with some marvelous ideas. So please put them in the chat. We'd love to. This is a good sharing time, actually, even though we are miles apart from each other. Okay, let's go ahead and start with the second section of the morning. And we'll look a little bit at kind of what kind of thinking that we need to kind of be ready for when we are implementing the active learning approach. And it's kind of a shift in the traditional thinking that we may have had in our training. First of all, we are working with and supporting a unique target population. And Lilli Nielsen specifically developed a lot of these, the approaches and the materials and the equipment for children who are blind, children who are visually impaired, deaf, blind,
anything big,
or developmentally 0 to 48 months. So that's kind of the developmental range we're talking about. Obviously, a lot of the children who fall within this group have additional disabilities, cognitive types of disabilities, physical disabilities, that may be limiting in terms of their ability to reach and explore and to appreciate books and a lot of different things like that. Progress also is often measured in small steps. So we look at where a child is now, and our growth is a child growth, kind of looking at the child's own growth from point A to point B, rather than thumbing through developmental charts and figuring out, this child ought to be at this point. The challenge for us is to set appropriate expectations, but really set expectations. If there are no expectations that children are going to learn and children are going to grow, it won't happen. And then our job is, once we figure out, and the expectations are hard sometimes because we really don't know what kids' potential is. But then our job, though, is to facilitate the progress. We meet kids where they are developmentally, and some children, there is quite a wide discrepancy between developmentally where they are and where they are age-wise. And then we try to figure out how we can fairly closely develop age-appropriate types of activities, but also remain developmentally appropriate. And then we kind of want to be sure that we refrain from doing for children, and we let them do for themselves, which eliminates the need to manipulate their bodies and create a dependency on an adult. So again, this is a big part of the philosophy and the thinking and the approach of active learning, is to be sure that we are allowing children to take control of their own lives. And our job is to kind of structure the environment so that it is user-friendly. Observing children carefully is the way we find out what their preferences are, what their sensory strengths are, all those types of things when we are putting together what might be a really fun, interesting, and appropriate type of active learning activity or active learning setting. And we also need to listen to families. If you are in a classroom setting, listen to the teachers that are involved with the kids to find out what may motivate each individual child. So you're watching the child, but you're also getting feedback, and what's going to motivate the family to want to implement some of these things. If we're not meeting family needs or classroom needs, then a lot of these things just won't be implemented. So we need to provide that support of helping people to know what is possible to do and kind of triggering those things that are of interest and of priority for families and educators, if that's the setting that you're in. So we need to kind of snap out often out of our non-traditional, snap out of our traditional roles and move into non-traditional roles. If we're an O&M specialist teaching independent travel skills, and we are used to helping people in our training to cross streets, ride buses, whatever, this may not be where we are. For teachers of children who are visually impaired, we are maybe used to teaching Braille, a lot of the more traditional classroom academic skills. We may need to rethink those. Teachers of children who are deaf and hard of hearing, the area of communication and social development, we need to rethink where we're kind of going with that and how we would approach that. Same thing with speech language pathologists, occupational therapists, physical therapists. This is kind of a new range for many of us who are used to working with kids who are quite a bit older and who maybe don't have the complex combination of disabilities. Finally, one of our biggest roles is to provide welcome support and hope for families, and for, quite honestly, for classroom teachers and other support personnel too, who are maybe not quite sure where this journey should go or is going to go. And I want to give you one example because this just absolutely hits home to me when I think about providing welcome support and hope. I went out to see a foster family, and it was for a particular little girl that had been referred to the outreach program. And when I arrived, I noticed that this foster mom actually had 4 children with significant special needs that were at her home that she was fostering. But we went right over to the little girl that I was there to see, and we spent an amount of time working on some ideas and getting mom's feedback and kind of watching and observing and coming up with some plans and ideas for her. When we were finished and I was sort of getting ready to leave, mom quietly looked at me and said, I know you're not here for all of my children, but I do have one other child that is visually impaired, and I really don't know what to do. So I said, sure, let's go ahead and give it a try. So we went over and I met Ricardo. Ricardo had been a shaken baby. And at the time, I believe he was right around 2 years old, give or take a little bit. And without getting too graphic, he was a guy, because he had had such severe injuries, that his leg stuck straight up by his head and it did not come down. Very significant motor impairment, very significant. Obviously, he had cortical visual impairment as well. And mom was just really wanting to do something, but didn't know what to do. And I was a little bit like, okay, well, let's see what we can come up with. So what I chose to do was to take individual things to, first of all, get a sense of what he might be seeing, what he might be hearing, what he might be interested in, and what his physical movement capabilities were to interact with the outside world. So once I started bringing things up close to him, kind of holding them by the strings, some of the things that I was talking about earlier and other things, I noticed that he did have a head turn. And he was really interested in bumping into things and causing some movement and causing some things to happen if I positioned those things to one side of his head. So we played around and tried a variety of things and saw that there was really some potential here for him to be interacting and initiating that interaction himself.
40 pounds on Nutrisystem. But I really recommend.
Then we were able to move those things onto, you're going to be doing a tactile bar this afternoon. Well, I call it a mobile stand, and we were able to move things onto the mobile stand and have those things hanging. And as long as I tipped it up so that the objects kind of were more close into where he was, he started moving his head slightly, but he started moving his head, so he started interacting. So we got a good start at kind of figuring out what worked for him, and that he did have potential for learning and potential for reaching out to the environment. And before I left, and I will never forget this till the day I die, mom, foster mom, turned to me and she said, you know, she said, you have given me hope. We didn't solve all of this little guy's problems, but we did give mom some hope and some ideas and some things that she could do. So let's not forget that this is kind of a total package where we're focused on children, but we are also focused on the significant adults around that child. Let's go to the next slide, please. Guiding principles is our next thought. And these are ones that Lilli Nielsen came up with when she was talking about what is active learning all about. Her first and most ardent thing was all children are capable learners. She mentioned that the only couple of children that she ever met that were not able to learn did so because they were at the end of their lives and they were unable to muster the energy to really do anything other than just survive. Other than that, there should be some potential there for children to learn and to do some things that they currently are not showing us that they can do. So we can set expectations for success for all of our kids and then set up a good match environment for that's individualized for each particular child. This, we can't do cookie cutter at all. We really need to look at each child. And I want to give you an example too of both, we're going to talk about aha moments, but both aha moments and individualizing. I worked with a school district and I was in a classroom for children who were medically fragile. And a new little girl came into this classroom And I'm not exactly sure of what the etiology was in terms of her contractures, but she had arms that were extremely tight. She had a little bit of sideward movement, and her legs had contractures as well. And she was about 12 years old at the time, so she was a young lady. So the teachers were like, okay, where do we start here? And so they actually had in the center of their room, because they had a lot of various types of PT equipment, they had a hook that came down from the center of the room. And what I did is, and if you look in the Hold Everything booklet, if you're interested after I talk about this, I had a hula hoop hanger. So it's actually a hula hoop, and then it has pieces of elastic in 4 different places. So it levels it out. And and then it comes to a point up here where then it attaches to a hook or something up that hangs from the ceiling. So it's a kind of free flowing hula hoop thing. It's a little bit like the tactile bar that you will make this afternoon, only it goes completely around a child. So it is more, I would guess you could say, multi-dimensional and multi-spatial than just something that sits in front of you. So they positioned her comfortably on a mat on the floor so that she could kind of sit there. And then we hung this hula hoop hanger that had things hanging down from it periodically around the hula hoop that were also hanging from strings. One of which were those spoons that I just showed you about, that string of spoons. And immediately I could tell that she noticed the shininess or something from the spoon. And that was the thing that she just loved. She would grab a hold of it and shake it. And she would just giggle, belly laugh. And she just loved that. So we then, one day I came in and they actually had the hula hoop hanger on. And I just stood back and I just watched. And I watched her thought process, because there were things like a box and other types of items hanging around that she really didn't care that much about. But with her slight motion of her arm, she was able to bump the other objects and cause the hula hoop hanger to spin around. And she would just watch for those spoons to come, and they would come around, and then she would just snatch them and shake them and belly laugh. Talk about problem solving. And no one taught that to this young lady, Cindy. She figured it out for herself. So if you leave kids alone to do some problem solving and figuring out, if we put an environment that is user-friendly and is motivating, it will happen. The next thing that Lilli Nielsen absolutely insisted on is a hands-off approach. For example, refraining from controlling or guiding a child's hands, or manipulating their body in any way, or going, oh, listen to this, and jingling for a child something out here, but instead observing quietly and not interrupting what was happening during that session. Observing quietly because you want to see kind of what a child is able to find. Is this actually working for the child, or are there little tweaks that could be made? And not interrupting, because it's kind of like me when I'm trying to think about something and somebody flips the television on, it's totally distracting, and it winds me back to having to start to think again about what it was I was just reading or just trying to understand. And this is often what happens to our kids if we come midstream and start talking with a child or commenting on things when they are deep in thought. It can be really intrusive and it can be frustrating to kids. So kind of hands off and kind of keep your lips tight. Maximize responsiveness is the next one. First, starting with kids, keeping sessions short, and they will kind of tell you what is long enough by just the watching behaviors, and gradually increasing those as kids show they're more engaged and they're interested and they're finding a variety of different kinds of things. Ensure that the environment provides optimal sensory feedback. If you have somebody like Ricardo I was talking about that just has a slight head turn, you might want something that makes a sound or create some visual by simply a light pat, or kids who really are just doing some very light batting, something like maybe one of those plastic bags, crunchy bags that really makes a sound with very little touch is an important way to start. You can always up the ante as kids show you they're ready for more. Then infusing novelty. The balance here is to come up with things that have enough interest for a child, but aren't overly novel so that they are kind of threatening or overloading. So you can just watch as you start kind of sorting out what kids like and what is enough. And that can be what's enough sound produced. Some children need a lot of sound to be able to hear it. Some kids are very hypersensitive to sound, so they need us to kind of quiet the space down a little bit. And then you
This is
observe the
Kristen.
child. Yes.
Kay, we
Yes.
do have a good question. It's she asks, are we looking to have this take place in a quiet environment without other students?
It can be. In a perfect world, we might say yes, that would be ideal. And I'm going to kind of give a scenario in a few minutes of a little guy who entered a preschool classroom. And we all know in a preschool classroom how loud and crazy that can get. Some people's homes, if they have a number of children, can also get quite noisy. Ideally, especially if a child is very sensitive to disruptions and other things going on around them, ideally to find a place, at least to start, that is tucked away, and maybe a child is sheltered in a little cave type little room or box, or kind of off in a space by him or herself. That may be ideal for many children. Some kids have a better ability to sort of filter that out, and they might enjoy kind of knowing that other children are around by their noises. So I think it might depend a little bit on the scenario. But for many children, to start out with a quiet kind of environment is ideal if you're able to take at least snatches of time in a home's schedule, or in a preschool schedule, or kind of tuck a child to kind of more a back part of the room where things are not so crazy. Yes, for some children, I think you're right. That works much better. Thank you for that comment. Did I answer everything, or did I miss something? Okay, all right. So
Good.
yes, I'm sorry.
We're good.
Okay, thank you, thank you. The next point here is maximal to minimal physical support. Just like what was talked about as far as loud noises and disruptive kinds of auditory stuff for some kids, holding your body up for some children who are not able to, for example, sit upright without some support, takes a tremendous amount of energy. And that is a huge energy drain if we are trying to help them to start reach out. For example, if you present your tactile bar after you make it, and you are hoping that children will come and find the things that are there, many times if you start out either physically just supporting them, or putting them in some type of a seating or in a high chair with a pillow around them, which keeps them upright without having to really work hard, depending on what the goal is. But usually if you are helping a child to start interacting independently with something, it is really important to start out with pretty maximal support and then release that support as you see children are able to control their bodies a little bit more. Even lying down, some children benefit from, for example, a boppy pillow. I'm sure some of you are familiar with that, which is kind of a U-shaped pillow that has a puffy part on the back that you can kind of put around a child to kind of help their hands to sort of come in. That makes a huge difference sometimes. And if you look at things like the HOPSA dress, many times there will be full support for a child who is not yet able to bear weight on their feet. And then gradually that is lowered down so they can bear more and more weight on their feet and still function and kind of interact with the environment at the same time. So those are just important things to consider for a child's comfort, and also for their ability to kind of split their attention from controlling their bodies and being able to interact with things around them. The next slide talks about guiding principles, the second part. And this next one is looking for a child's can-do attitude and aha moments, a little bit like we talked about with Cindy. And this is to ensure that a child is acting on the environment and the environment, or i.e. us, are not acting on the child. And then observe for moments where a child is going, oh my gosh, I've got this, I can do this. A child smiling, vocalizing, perhaps doing some problem solving on their own. And one example I can give you here from kids that I have worked with was Timmy. Timmy was a little guy who had a stroke in utero, which meant that when he was born, he had use of one side of his body, but not the other. And he had gone through early intervention, but he became 3, and his parents really wanted him to enter into a preschool program, to have other children to interact with. He was an only child at the time, and to kind of have the whole preschool experience. So they brought him in. Not only were did his situation make it so he had a limited ability to interact with things, let's say on his right side, but he also had a very sensitive nervous system, and he was very, very sensitive to sounds and a lot of things going on around him. And so when he came into the classroom, and we all know, those who have worked in preschool classrooms, they can be a little loud and crazy at times. And he would last about 7 to 10 minutes, we timed it, until he actually would start cyclically vomiting. He was just too overloaded. And they tried this a few times thinking, well, maybe the next time would work. And the parents, of course, were very distraught, and so was Timmy. And so we tried to figure out. So we thought, well, maybe we would try. And again, we had started out with a cardboard box type of little room, which again provided sort of a buffer between Timmy and all of the craziness that was going on around him, to give him sort of like a little cave to kind of be in. And the minute he was placed into this space, he physically, you could see him relaxing. So it was a matter of then going from just having him have some timeout, basically timeout time, to just kind of regroup and relax when he got overdone. And then we thought, well, it would be great then to turn this into an actually exploration thing for him. Once he got, and he really, really started settling into the preschool environment, as long as he had some time that he could get away from all the noise and the things going on. This classroom, as many of you, again, who work in preschool classrooms know, was just loaded with stuff, chairs and all kinds of things. And so it was really, there was not a good space to keep this box. And then this was one where there was a morning program and an afternoon program. So the teacher would have to shift around and find a place to store it. So what we decided to do was to take, they had 2 bookcases that were back to back. And we decided we could pull those apart and then put a mat underneath. You could put a resonance board as well. We happen to have a mat. And then I got a piece of plexiglass with the holes drilled in it, which is much like the top of a little room. And we were able to Velcro each side of that onto the sides of the bookcases that we had just separated. So we actually made a little room, because there was a wall on the one side, the bookcase, backs of the bookcases, and then it had an opening, and then the plexiglass on top. So it was absolutely wonderful. So we started putting things in there for Timmy to find. And he was doing a lot of exploring with his left hand. And this went on for, I don't know, a couple of weeks. And then one time we were just simply watching him do his thing. And I looked over, and he took his left hand and literally scooped up his right hand and brought it up to where those things were up there, so that his right hand could also be a part of that exploring. And he completely did this on his own by being given the opportunity to do that. It was totally amazing. And that's one of those aha moments where you think, wow. And so if we set things up correctly, we can get a lot of these really neat things to happen. Kristen?
Okay, there was a question, how big of a box in relation to the child? How much bigger?
Usually I would say at least, several inches. I have found that, for example, an appliance box works quite well. In the Hold Everything booklet, there are some instructions of using a certain dimension. It talks about, I believe, the dimension of that box. And you might just kind of see what works for a particular child. You don't want it so big where a child feels kind of lost in it. It's kind of like a newborn baby in a new crib. You kind of want the space to kind of be defined. Otherwise, the child is kind of out in open space and it can be frightening. But you don't want it so crowded that they're kind of all cramped in there and feel claustrophobic. So probably with a little bit of space on either side and enough room to bring it in. Sometimes later on, if you want to do some interactive things inside it too, outside of a child freely exploring, it's nice to have room for an adult or another child to slide in there next to the child and may have it be a kind of a social turn-taking kind of activity too, if that seems appropriate. Does that answer that question, I think? Okay.
Yes.
Okay. Another part of this is repetition, 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 providing opportunities for kids to practice. If we're learning to play the piano, we have to do it over and over again, making mistakes and learning and refining our skill. If we're learning a sport, the same thing. If we are learning to check out the environment, we need opportunities to practice. So allow the child time to work through problem solving without bailing them out, and then make adjustments to the environment as needed to ensure that a child is able to have some success if you look and there's some frustration or it's really not working. Then wait time. Wait time, and again, many of you probably are very, very familiar with this, but this bears talking about, is basically, as an adult, if you are making a request of a child, or if you are watching or you're doing some turn taking with the child or whatever the activity is, if you are somewhat involved and it is an activity where you are expecting or hoping for a response, we often need to wait what might feel an exorbitant amount of time in our brains for a response to occur. You figure a child has to hear or see what your response is, what your request is. They have to process that request. They have to regroup their body and then present some type of a response. And that can take quite a long time to respond. So if we remain quiet, sometimes 30 seconds, sometimes even more, bite our tongues, sit on our hands, whatever it takes, before we actually look for a response. If we do not get a response, then we certainly can quietly repeat that after a period of time to see if a child needs another go at whatever it is. If we're presenting something, or we're saying something, or we're signing something, or gesturing, or whatever. If we rush, we miss a lot of opportunities. We are really on child's time, not our time. And that's just a really important thing to remember, and something really hard to do sometimes. The pause strategy, and there is a videotape that will come up next, and I believe we have this one. And what I'd like to do is to have any comments or questions about what you see here. This is a mom that is using some pauses with her child for a specific purpose.
The title, Hand Under Hand, is written on a slide of a young boy with his hands placed.
Whoops, that's not the one. This one should be the pause strategy, sorry. We can find that one. If it is not to be found, we can move on. Just let me know, please.
Okay, that was the one that I clicked on. That's in the PowerPoint.
Okay, all right. So we can't find that one. Basically, I'll just kind of talk through it. I didn't want to be a talking head, so I think these videos, first of all, they show kids and families and things doing things. But let me just explain. This one was a mom who was involved in an activity with her child. And she was encouraging her child to communicate a desire to continue an activity. And that activity, and I'm trying to think, I can't remember exactly what they were doing, but it was some type of a play activity. And mom figured out something that was of high interest to her child, because of course everybody has to have a motivation for doing things we do. I don't think many of us would do a full-time, very demanding job if there wasn't a paycheck on the other end, or if we didn't feel some sense of satisfaction from what we're doing, or a whole variety of reasons. So that is a real important. But it allows, if when you are requesting something, and in this case, I think she was asking, or she was offering something and hoping that her child would interact with her, she gave several moments for a natural response to the activity she was doing. Then when it was something kind of new she was introducing, she said to him, I'm going to do it. And she said, for you. Maybe she could have said, I'm going to do it first, so that you're modeling some things if a child is not familiar with what it is that you might be asking or what the activity is. And then after the child has had a chance to have you model that, then having the child participate more fully, and then waiting for a verbal response, some kind of a gesture response, or a reach, or whatever that is. This certainly empowers a child to know that what they have to enter into and their part of the give and take is equally important as the adults. So we're not taking over the situation. We are allowing time for that child to be an equal partner in what we're doing, once we figure that they kind of understand what that is. And any comments on that are very welcome from your perspective. Okay, I'm not seeing comments pop up. The last part of this slide talks about feedback at the end of the sessions. And I think, again, earlier someone commented about really letting kids just go, and that is ideal. But sometimes to add in a little bit of the communication or language part of things, and to reflect on what just went on, to kind of recap, it is okay after a child is kind of done, has had their time, looking at things, touching things, doing things, to give feedback on what just happened during that session as the adult. So you can kind of get in close and maybe even jingle and say, oh, that jingled, or whatever you do, and just kind of keep it short and brief. But you can feed in language and feed in feedback once a child has had time to be in a quiet environment by him or herself. Okay, if no additional chats, let's move on to the next one. And this is kind of the focus here, is effective, respectful interactions. And this is really the key to the active learning approach. I don't know how many of you had a chance to read, and this was back quite a long time ago, I think in the maybe late 90s, early 2000s, Chen and Downing actually wrote a book on techniques, interaction techniques, when you are you're working with a child who is deafblind, and ways to give that child more control of their body and more control of situations, and way for us to pull back. The first one is mutual tactile attention. And what that means is, and usually you can kind of look and see, what is a child doing? If a child is lying on the floor and they're kind of, patting the floor with their hand, then we could enter into that. Mutual tactile attention does not demand anything from a child. We are simply joining in with an activity that the child already initiated, something very simple. They had a video that went with this too, which was amazing, but I could not find a part of it where a child was tapping on a drum and the adult came and entered in with the tapping on the drum. So if you find some activity, a repetitive type of thing, you can simply enter in as an interested party. And what that does certainly is helps with joint attention, which means both people are involved in an activity that they are paying attention to together, and it becomes kind of a social activity. The next one is hand under hand guidance. And again, I'm hoping that nowadays, when I went through my training program, we knew nothing about this. And it was always, well, you know, guide their hand to something. And we were always grabbing a hand and guiding. And it always really bothered me. Once we started thinking about what that does and the reaction, which of course, if you think about it, if you grab a child's hand, what is often the reaction you get? Jerk back, right? They are feeling out of control of their hand or their body or whatever. So hand underhand guidance, where instead of taking a child's hand and guiding it towards something, we are simply taking our hand underneath their hand, and we can show them things. We could do simple nursery rhyme hand play things with it. We can help them to kind of reach. It can be hand under arm, hand under forearm, hand under hand, whatever. For exploring books that might have braille in them, we can pull our hand back and let them touch the bumpy dots. A lot of various, and we'll see in a video in a few minutes about some of the applications of this. But how nice this is for kids to have somebody who is not controlling their hands, but is simply helping them or guiding their hands as needed. Coacting from behind a child is another strategy that Chen and Downing talked about. For example, and I put my spoon away, but I'm going to use this pen as a spoon. If you look at the scoop motion required by a child to use a spoon and bring it up to their mouth, that is a really tricky thing to learn. If I sit behind a child and I maybe have my hand on the spoon, the child is riding along and is feeling the motion that I do and bringing it up to their mouth, they can kind of feel that motor movement that is required to get that spoon up. Then gradually I can move my hand to the end of the spoon. The child can hold onto the spoon, and I would simply just guide as needed from the end of the spoon while the child is actually doing all of the motion to bring it up to their mouth. So really looking at a lot of things that can be done from behind, which would replicate the motor movement, including eating with a spoon or various other things that would replicate the action that is required to do that type of activity. Touch cues are huge. These are touches on the body, whatever it is, to let a child know what is about to happen. For our youngest kids and our developmental youngest children, a lot of times when they are picked up, it is this sudden jolt of somebody comes and just picks me up. If we instead touch underneath their arms, they know eventually that, oh, that means I'm going to be picked up. Or if at diaper changing time, they need to be rolled over onto their side. If I touch a child to that side before I roll that child over, and I can add words to that too. There is language that you can add to that, but the touch cues themselves really do help children to know what is about to happen before that action or somebody acts on them. And it also is a way to ask for permission to pick them up or permission to roll them over, give them a chance to think about it, and then that action occurs. And that is just a respectful way to interact. Object cues and object to body contact is where any kind of an object that is meaningful to a child is used to provide cues to help the child anticipate what is going to happen. If you hand a child or touch a bottle to a child before you actually go to feed the child, that child will know, oh, okay, we're gonna start eating now. I had one family that I worked with that they had because their child was very much into textures, they had a piece of cloth that replicated the texture of the child's car seat. And they would hand that to the child as they were talking about going bye-bye. And the child knew, oh, okay, we're going to go and get into the car once they got that connection. So there are a lot of hand a child a clean diaper, and the child knows that, oh, okay, this is what we're going to do now. So a lot of these can be slid under a child's arm, under a child's leg, touched to their body, however that's done. But an object can be very valuable in helping a child know what's to come. Sound cues is another thing, shaking a sound toy, tapping on a bottle, doing things where a child starts to equate, including a voice of someone. Somebody saying, hey, Timmy, it's mommy. And so those types of things, so that a child can equate a sound with what's going on. And the next one is verbal descriptions in the next slide. And that is the use of words or signs or gestures, whatever it is, that, but usually it is a verbal description or using words rather than textures or objects to describe actions and events. The child will, of course, at least eventually, need to understand the meaning of those words for this to be meaningful. So you can combine touch cues with words, and you can combine objects with words or signs or whatever form of communication is being used. And so that, I think, really is helpful to know that often you combine it first, and then you can kind of pull back on one as a child gains a better understanding of just that verbal part or the word part. Coactive signs, of course, is where you are actually helping a child to do simple things like eat or more, or whatever, and you are modeling those for a child. And then tactile signs, where underneath a child's hands, you are creating the signs that of what you are actually interacting with them about and for the communication purposes. So that what I'd like to do now, if there are no chat items, which I don't see anything popping up, is to show the first video here is called Kaylee, Hand Under Hand. And I would like for you to look first at what strategies are used with Kaylee by the adults in her life and for what purposes, and then how effective were they based on Kaylee's reactions to them. So let's go ahead and take a look at Kaylee and see what you think.
How do we get her to use her hands? Don't grab for her hand, instead touch her arm.
Do you feel that? Do you feel me bang, bang, banging? Is Ann banging? Bang, 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 banging? Yeah, that's my hand banging. Do you want to help? Do you want to help?
Good job! Yay!
That's another approach where you kind of start doing something and just let her do it.
That's what she does right after.
Do you want to help? No. You don't know? You want to help me on thing? You could try. Bang, bang, banging. Is Ann banging? Bang, 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 banging. Yeah, that's my hand banging. Do you want to help? You want to help?
Good job! Yay!
That's
Good
another
job!
approach where you kind of start doing something and just let her
do it. That's what she does right after.
Do you want to help? No. You don't know? You want to help me on thing? You could try your maraca. Oh, you are going to help. Oh, yay.
Good job.
Going to help me.
Good job!
Do you like that? Tell me when you're ready. We'll do it again. Oh, yay. You want to give it a bunch? You know what? I'm going to bring another pan out.
Ooh!
What's that? Did I bring another pan? You bang over there. I'm going to bang over here. Yeah, another pan. Do you want to help?
But how do we get her to use her hands? Use your hand under her hand. Wait for her to reach for your hand. Waiting helps children become active learners.
Okay. Thank you, Anne. Again, I'm not sure if we have any feedback on that video clip that you just watched, on what types of strategies that you noticed. While we're waiting for anyone, okay, I see one that says wait time. And yes, that was huge, wasn't it? You notice she was very guarded with her hands at first. She really was a little concerned about what was going to happen. Kristen, maybe I think I missed one or two of those. I think I did see somebody talking about hand under hand. I think I missed a couple of them. Could you help
Sure.
repeat some of the chat
Yep,
comments?
this is Kristen. Hand under hand, coactive movements, mutual attention, wait time. I loved how they were asking her if she was ready and then respected when she was not. When someone contacted her leg, she pulled her hands back. And I love how the adult put herself in the child's proximity, but never grabbed her hand.
Beautiful, beautiful. And this really is, I think, a very good example of a very respectful interaction. And it was very effective too. She was willing to extend her hands and participate in an activity that was a really cool one. And if you noticed, even her right hand then was doing a lot of that type of activity on the other side that she was doing over on her left side. The adult subtly introduced different materials to create varied sounds. So once she had been doing the banging on the floor thing for a while, in order to kind of mix it up, the metal bowl was introduced so that she made a sound. And you notice that piqued her curiosity, because eventually she brought her hand out to explore and see, what was this change? What made this really neat sound? So all these strategies encourage her to initiate, reach for, and interact with objects and help her to cause something to happen. It also, as you are indicating by the feedback, it helped to build trust with the adult, that the adult will not grab her hand, control her hand, and take charge of the situation, but very respectfully will ask permission and will wait for that to happen. And how huge that is. Then her reaction, her hand retracted initially, but eventually she initiated and implemented a lot of the strategies and the actions that were a part of that kind of co-acting activity. I think it's important to note the parents' joyful reaction to seeing her initiate, reaching, and playing with things on her own. And hopefully if the parents were watching and they had a chance to talk about those strategies that really encouraged her to do that, that would be something then that the parents could also implement and encourage to happen later on. I'm not sure about time, if we have time for the second one. I think maybe not. Let's go ahead and we'll just move on to the last section of this, because I think we have about 5 minutes left. Kristen, correct?
Yes, that's correct.
Okay, so we just wanted to kind of cover, and this is the part that is kind of boring, actually, to most people, but very critical when we are particularly working in some type of an early intervention system or working in an educational system where we really need to be sure we're planning things out. We have documentation and ways to observe, and then we are documenting results related to goals and things. So let's just kind of quickly go through this in the last few minutes. And then I'm going to refer to the two websites that you have below, where there are forms, and I'll just real quickly go over kind of what they have in there. But the first one is to listen to significant people in a child's life and observe directly the child to the greatest extent possible, and do that carefully over time. Sometimes we only see kids periodically if you're itinerant model and you only kind of come in every so often. So you might rely more on the educators and or family members who are seeing the kids more. But by listening to significant people and by observing the child, you can find out what their preferences are, what their sensory and motor strengths are, and what their limitations are, and then work with those when you are putting together your activity or your space. The second one is selecting a space or activity goal. And that is certainly based on a good fit with the child's preferences, strengths that we just talked about, what their room for growth is. So it's a good developmental match for where they are now and has the ability to expand as they master part of that. They can move on and you can stretch it. The family and school priorities, again, we kind of talked about if we are encouraging something that doesn't happen to fit in with the priority of the family or the priority of the classroom, what's going on, the likelihood of this happening is not very great unless we can figure out some way to work it into that. So at-home learning, what the other children in the class are doing is great to observe what they're learning about, and the activities and kind of the curriculum that they're doing is great. And then how can we enhance the child's participation in maybe not exact, but similar kinds of things, and they can learn and to participate in their own way. The third one here is implement and observe over time. Implement the chosen activity. Okay, you've gone through and you've figured out what space, what activity, and your goal, and then you observe and record behavior over time. That may mean that a child went from finding one thing that was dangling to finding 3 different things, or spent 2 seconds interacting with something and then moved on to more intense and more ongoing kinds of interactions. And so the goal and the recorded behavior can vary depending on what you want to do. Then through that, you can determine if there is a need for modifying the space or the activity to be more user-friendly for the child and to better match the child's interests, strengths, and needs. The next one is make and document modifications as you've figured out maybe are needed, and do this over time. You can remove or change objects you've presented. You can modify locations of objects or different things. You can suspend them closer to the body, as we talked about. Maybe a child has kind of very subtle movement of the head. You need to have things closer or further away because they're kind of bored with this. They can get things real easily. Then you can start to stretch them a little bit and position nearer to certain body parts. Maybe a child has very active use of their legs, then maybe that's the area that you focus on, at least to begin with. Changing the position of the child as well is huge. And then, for example, rolling a child over onto his or her side, if you're using your tactile bar, and this brings their hands together on the side and available to interact with things. And then using a different space. The last one is documenting progress toward the active learning goal. And the forms that are on here, which we have about a minute left, are through the Active Learning Space website, which is the https://activelearningspace.org, is a whole bunch of things. Active learning planning sheet, a skills sheet, a little room and HOPS address, and ESF board and support events, observation forms, and other observation forms. And then documenting progress on your IEP goals, objectives, and other skills. They have a form. Then from the Washington State Sensory Disability Services, the other website is one where you can use, it can look at how kids use sensory channels and then their likes and dislikes of things. And that will kind of better help you to plot out. There's some really nice forms that are available to be used. I think we are there in time for our next little refresher break.
All right, this is Kristen. Thank you so much, Kay. I don't think there are new questions in the chat.
Okay.
So, Anne, we can start our next 5-minute timer and come back at 11.
Okay, thank you.
Regarding what Kay presents. Thank you.
Okay, we are now launching into the third of 3 parts of our morning to give you some background, and hopefully some of these ideas will be helpful when you go ahead and create your own things this afternoon, your tactile bars. The focus that we tried to make for this were actually 3 different parts because of the various people involved in this workshop. One is certainly early movement and exploration, particularly people like O&M specialists, orientation mobility specialists, who are working on kind of independent travel, helping kids to reach out to the environment. Physical therapists certainly are interested in early movement. So those are particular areas. So that's one of them. The second one was early communication, which of course is extremely important for kids with hearing loss, as well as kids who are blind or visually impaired, because that is an area that is impacted by both of those types of losses. And then early literacy is the third one. So what I thought we would do is start out, because I'm guessing that there are some people in this group who are not automatically working with young children or developmentally young children, and kind of just to get sort of a sense of developmentally, what are we talking about with that, within these early years. So one thing I do want to just spotlight a little bit is in the Lap Time and Lullabies, there is a emergent literacy developmental milestones, which covers really all the areas we just talked about and then some. The Lap Time and Lullabies looks at literally all the developmental areas, including sensory, exploring the world, using hands for fine motor, all kinds of things. And each section has its own booklet. But I'd like to just kind of start by looking at kind of between the birth and 36 months, some of the major kind of milestones or things that you might happen. Now, this is developmentally 0 to 36 months. This does not mean our children who are 6 years old with some pretty significant disabilities are not able to do that. So there may be a difference between chronological and developmental age, obviously. But kids start out with exploration of their own bodies. And if you look at a young child, very young child, they're putting their hands in their mouth, they're mouthing other things, they're kind of checking out their own body, but there is very little reach outside of a child's own body. It really is all kind of on-body exploring and on-body experiences. The next part, and I have visual here, but this really has to do with all sensory really, but visual exploration. Before a child is even ever able to move their body, they can begin in a kind of a reduced sense, but begin to visually start to scan the environment and see things, maybe things very close, maybe things not at high contrast, maybe they aren't really seeing things at all. But kids who have some usable vision certainly do start using their vision. Hearing also does tie in there and aids in that visual exploration as well. Then kids begin to really start moving their bodies out to kind of interact with the environment. Things like reaching out for things, bringing things to their mouth, banging things on a surface, that type of thing, where they are really actively exploring things outside of their own body. And then rolling to walking. So we have kids who begin to start kind of rolling their body around. Then they start creeping and crawling and walking. So if for kids who are able to do that, but there is certainly a great progression of these gross motor skills, which also allow a child to start to explore the environment around them. Another component in early exploration is search. And that, of course, means searching for hidden, and for kids who are blind, that means pretty much everything, because nothing is visual. There may be auditory cues or whatever. And so really looking at searching for hidden people and objects. That can be things too that just sort of roll out of view, and the idea of object permanence, which is a cognitive skill that something still exists, even though I cannot see it, touch it, or hear it, or in any way make sense of it. It still exists because I once had it and I know it just kind of went away. That's an important part of that search skill. Leaving adult contact, and that certainly is linked with the ability to attach emotionally to a significant adult. And usually that starts out with parents or other caregivers, other family members, where they really rely on the comfort of having a secure base, is what they call it, for checking back in if they become fearful when they start to leave at first, or just knowing that there is somebody there in the event that they get to feeling a little concerned when they are not in direct physical contact with an adult. Simple household tasks are really a big part of this as well. That's again part of routines that families and children have, and ways that kids can participate in little kind of early things, such as, wiping a table surface or a high chair tray with a little rag, or stirring something if they're baking in the kitchen, or other kinds of things like that. Throwing something in the wastebasket, either with help or independently. So those kinds of things have a lot, as a big component too, of early movement and exploration. Climbing is a huge one. Whether that means climbing stairs, which certainly happens crawling up and scooting down, or that means stepping up, holding onto a handrail, or if that means climbing on things like playground equipment and other kind of playthings. But that is another component. The idea of safety and rules gradually kind of kicks in. At first, children, of course, are very dependent on an attentive adult, so that they know that if they get in trouble or they start towards something that is unsafe, an adult will take care of that. But gradually, kids learn when a parent replies, hot, that triggers something, that I better not touch that because it could be very painful. Or holding a parent's hand if, let's say, they're outside and in an unfamiliar area or near a parking lot or whatever. So the idea of safety and rules and setting parameters for children is another important part of this. Then familiar surroundings and location phrases is huge. Familiar surroundings meaning things like their own room, rooms of a house, and what goes on in the different rooms of the house, learning about all that stuff. Things that happen differently in the kitchen than they do in the bathroom where you take a bath, than they do in the bedroom. So starting out there, things that are familiar, and then moving outside to a familiar yard and learning about why that fence is around there and what's out there of grass and hills and different things to play with out there, and then expanding from there. And in the course of exploring a lot of these familiar surroundings, they learn location phrases or concepts like spatial concepts: in, out, on, off, up, down, as well as other types of concepts, objects and all kinds of things, movements and stuff like that. But that is a really important part as a basis for early movement and exploration. If you look at these are not exclusive to just early and movement exploration, though. They are also important for the other two parts we're going to talk about. So let's move on to early communication. This I saw, and I kind of like the way this was captured. It's very simplistic, but I think it does help us to kind of look at, if we're not expected to be a speech language pathologist, but kind of look at how kids kind of transition from one stage to another in the first 2 years. The first stage is discoverers, and this is really just the whole foundation of communication. The attachment that we just talked about is very important, with the mutual gaze or mutual touch and singing together and being held. That's huge. And then identifying or feeling your own feelings, and then later on identifying sort of what those feelings are, but initially starting with a smile or a turn away if you don't like something, and then reaching, exploring surroundings has a lot to do with the discoverer stage, and then first sounds, gestures, or signs, and then imitation of others. This kind of back and forth stuff that starts to go on, but imitating maybe actions of others or sounds that are produced. So sounds and signs. Turn taking, and again, that's what I just was sort of talking about, this back and forth. In the discoverer stage, it is very adult-led. Children kind of need a little bit more coaching and a little better idea. So an adult might initiate, or adult might listen for a child to make a sound and then initiate back and then wait for the child to kind of come back again. This anticipation of routines is an important part of this stage of early communication. Hearing bathwater, seeing something happen, hearing keys come out of a pocket, enjoying early games also like peekaboo, patty cake, stuff like that is all part of this discover stage. The next one is communicators. And this is when kids start presenting a message with a purpose, not simply just kind of emitting sounds and kind of getting the hang of what's going on in the world. And this is the foundation for talking and or signing. And this makes the communication connection. So in other words, if I put my arms up, I am telling someone that I would like you to pick me up. So the child is starting to, either through gestures or whatever they're using, starting to initiate a request or starting to talk, communicate in a purposeful way to someone else. Eye gaze, gestures, things like that, shaking a head, no, things like that are happening. Engaging in joint attention, which we talked about early, paying attention to the same object or activity intentionally and for social reasons. I want to be involved in that game that you're playing or that activity, or I want to be in the kitchen stirring things with you. The third stage is first word users, and that is beginning to talk or sign, or both. And then using familiar objects and actions that are important to the child. Those are the things they're going to talk about first. Things like mama, maybe a blankie, maybe a favorite pet that they hear the name of. Those things that are very, very important to the child in their everyday life. And so it may be parts of words too, like instead of a banana, which is a big mouthful, they may say Nana, because they are requesting that they would like, or they're naming something that they are eating at the time. A child begins to understand simple directions and phrases at this time. Sit down, hold on, wait please, those kind of very simple types of things. And then combiners. This is getting closer to 24 months developmentally, where kids are progressing to 2-word phrases. They're able to change the tone of their voice too, to change a 2-word statement into a 2-word question. Mommy gone or mommy gone, something like that. Understand functions of objects, they begin to know, and they begin to understand spatial words, like we talked about in the exploration. They listen to short, simple stories and begin to point to pictures if they are able to see them. If there are any questions on those, I am open, or comments, I am open to hearing those. If not, we'll go on to early literacy.
This is Kristen. There is
Okay.
one question. Would you agree that the respectful, effective interactions and the discover stage teach children receptive language skills?
I definitely do, and particularly if we are doing the wait and we are kind of being respectful in demonstrating things to kids without, again, I think there are many ways to do that, but one is a real turnoff, and kids are not going to be often, most kids, I would say, well, kids start out usually kind of not wanting to be manipulated. And if we are respectful to them, they will understand that they are respected, and they will be more receptive to a lot of things, including communication and things with others. And they will be more trusting of other people in communicating. I hope that answered. If not, shoot it up again, please. Okay, and then this next one is early literacy, and this is kind of like the 0 to 36 months, or the first 3 years of life. The first one is forming relationships. Are you seeing a pattern here? Really, all of these areas require this forming a relationship, attachment, something with significant others. It is not always a parent, but many times it is, but some significant person in starting to form relationships with others is huge. Communicating meaningfully, again, having the ability to somehow start to communicate, gesturing, facial expressions, utterances, whatever it is, but really starting to communicate wants, needs, and requests. Sensory skills, vision, tactile and listening, to understand the world and to access pictures and symbols if a child is able to do that. And symbols could be tactile symbols, they could be visual symbols, whatever those are. Learning through play, and this learning through play is it. And I think, unfortunately, in many of our preschool programs, they've been forced to kind of rush things, and many programs do not see play being as valuable as it used to be, but it is absolutely huge. With play, it is enjoyable, and there is no right or wrong. It is simply an act of discovering things and learning about things in your real life. So it goes from very early, just playing with objects by mouthing them, to all the way up to pretend play and more abstract play. Exploring the world, we just talked about that. Kids being able to really get out there and figure out the world, and particularly kids who are blind or deafblind really need to actually be out there interacting with the world in a very direct sense. Reading together has been looked at as being one of the most critical experiences in a child's life for literacy later on. But for many of our children, it may not be the traditional sense of reading a book. And in the Lap Time and Lullabies, there are just a ton of different ideas of ways that you can add song, and you can add rhymes, and you can add move together things, and you'll see in a few minutes different kinds of books that can be used, adapted books that kind of bring things to life. But in some sense, that social thing of a parent taking an interest in literacy and the child being included in some type of a literacy, whether it's traditional or non-traditional, that experience is very important. Investigating books, and again, all types of books. We have bath books that are plastic and squishy. We have books with cardboard pages. We have books with paper pages. We have all kinds of books, cloth books, and kids need to have experience with a variety of different kinds of books, as well as their parts, the cover of the book, turning pages of the book, handling the book in many different ways, eventually figuring out what's upside down and right side up. Then developing symbolic thinking. We talked about pretend play, and that actually is one of the starting points of more sophisticated symbolic thinking for kids. And then, of course, they move all the way from that to written and or tactile symbols that start to make sense as they encounter them in their life. The other one here is using tools, all kinds of tools. A traditional tool for children who are blind or visually impaired that they will use for travel purposes, most will, at some point in their life, is the use of a long cane. And those of you who are a mobility specialist and you are working on introducing a long cane to children who are good candidates for that are helping with one form of tool use. But this starts there's been research that's looked at short, simple tools start first. So something like the spoon, things kids use in our everyday life, toys, sticks, pulling a stool up to a counter to reach the water, everything like that are tools, and kids can benefit from a whole variety of experiences with various tools that they are able to interact with and use purposefully. And I don't know if there are any comments on the literacy part before we move on to some actual practical examples. Okay.
No, there are
Kristen?
not.
All right, thank you. All right, so exploring my world. Let's look at that one first. What's pictured here is a bib or a smock. This also comes from the Hold Everything booklet, and this is something that I have used a lot with children, different forms of it. This one is made out of cloth, and this one's a bright red one, and it has strings that tie it onto a child's body. On the front of this bib are sewn on some small 1-inch, I guess you would call them curtain rings. And there are what, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, about 8 of them sewn on the whole different parts of this bib. And on these rings are attached with some of the metal rings. I guess they're called metal book rings that you can open and close. Those clamp onto the rings so that you can easily move things around. And this is one thing that I have found particularly helpful for kids who are at that stage that we talked about, that they really are kind of body bound and they are exploring their own bodies. And in the course of exploring their bodies, these are kids who might, grab their shirt and start chewing on it, but they're mostly just kind of checking out their own selves. And this, to attach something like this, is wonderful. And then adding things just like you would on the tactile bar or other kinds of environments that we just talked about, the materials, as long as they're safe, it's wonderful. So this is a way to get kids to kind of start exploring right there before they're actually reaching out to interact with things. This can be a smock that is for a child, but you can have a bigger version too that then an adult can wear, so that, let's say a mom is rocking and snuggling and singing to a child, that there are things anchored onto mom that the child can then find as they are kind of moving their hands and things like that. So that can happen. There are many different smocks and bibs. I've used plastic ones, and then I just use that sticky Velcro, soft Velcro that you can just stick onto and to stick the loops on. I've used large bibs, pull over the head types of bibs, and you can use that. Some kids have drooling bibs that they use anyway, and you can attach things onto that. So there's a lot of variety that can be used. But let's take a look, please, at, unless there are any questions, let's take a look at, let me see, I think we have both of these video clips. And the first one is called Anna in a Little Room. And then the second one is Sonia using a hops address on an H track. And please, when you are watching, think about what strategies were used in these video clips and how effective were they in nurturing exploration. And then how could they also promote communication and literacy? Use the chat feature, please, if you have thoughts on these. As after we'll go to one video, we'll stop and see if there are any chat, and then we'll go right on to the second one if there are no chat, or we'll already address the chat ones for the first one. So let's go ahead and start. Anna in a Little Room, please.
A title reads, Anna in a Little Room. Anna sits on a resonance board in a little room. Around her, plastic and metal items are suspended at head height on elastic cord. With both hands, she brings a large plastic ring to her mouth. At the same time, she tugs on a metal cup using both her feet, holding it almost on the resonance board. She explores the plastic ring with both hands and puts her finger through a large metal ring attached to it. She bangs on the wall behind her with her right hand. She bangs on the resonance board with her right hand. She continues to hold the plastic ring in her left hand and the metal cup between her 2 feet. Her feet release the metal cup. It springs upward, tapping her forehead. She smiles, changes her grasp on the plastic ring from her left to right hand, turns to her left, and pushes against the wall behind her. She bends down and pulls the plastic ring almost to the resonance board. She sits up straight and pulls and squeezes the plastic ring with both hands. She reaches behind and taps on the wall with her right hand. She releases the plastic ring and turns to the wall. Her forehead taps a small pan with the lid suspended on elastic. She holds the lid in her left hand. With her right hand, she taps a large patch of artificial turf on the wall. Anna brings the metal lid to her mouth. She holds the pan in her left hand and the lid in her right hand. She bangs the pan against the wall. She reaches with her right hand to explore other items. She grasps a wooden tube with both hands and brings it to her mouth. She stretches the elastic cord and the tube slides down. A title reads, Penricton Center for Blind Children.
Okay, were there any comments from the group about what you saw or what you thought about this one before we move on to the next video?
This is Kristen. We have a comment. It says, so it's not too overwhelming to have so many objects dangling down, being in the midst of so many. She seems okay with it though.
Yes, you are correct though to be looking at that. For some children that could put them over the top, and you are absolutely right. And that is a balancing act to kind of look individually with each child. She did seem fine with it, and she seemed to enjoy being able to find things. She had stuff sitting on her head. So for her, it seemed fine. But you are absolutely correct. You need to look at each individual child and what's comfortable for them. Good point.
And this is Kristen. Another comment, it's good to remember that students with higher level physical abilities also benefit from a little room. And then a question, how long of a time period do you have the child explore the room at one session?
Again, I would observe and see. Some of it might be dictated if the child is in a preschool program, that this is their go-to spot when it's a free choice activity, and that's what they like to do. That might dictate the amount of time. Some of it might be dependent on if they're still actively engaged in what's going on and doing different things. That might make a difference. So I think there might be a lot of different factors that would make a difference in the amount of time. And but observing a child will kind of give you a good kind of idea of whether it's enough or not, or too much. Usually you do start out with shorter sessions and then expand it depending on how a child is doing. And I think hopefully that answered that question. And let's go ahead on to Sonia using a HOPS address on an H track, please.
Title reads, Sonia using a HOPS address. Sonia, wearing tap shoes, is suspended in a HOPS address over a resonance board. She moves about the edges of the resonance board with the toes of her shoes and then moves off onto the open carpet. Sonia touches a large circular bin in the middle of the room. The bin is approximately 3 feet tall and 5 feet in diameter. She taps the edge briefly, then moves away. Sonia moves onto the resonance board, slides and taps her feet, then moves off. New video scene. Sonia slides and taps her feet on the resonance board, then moves off.
She seems okay. I'm not sure she doesn't go after the episode.
New video scene. Sonia touches the large circular bin. She begins to slowly trail the edges of the entire bin with her toes and backs of her hands.
holding on to it the whole way. Do you see how she kept her body the whole way, the entire time?
Sanya moves on to the open carpet area.
I get to show this on Monday because I'm giving a lecture. I like this one. This is good. Yes.
Sanya moves on to the resonance board, slides and taps her feet.
Very much because I'd like to show people a year ago and then today.
A title reads, "Thank you to the Penricton Center for Blind Children for the use of this."
Okay. Were there questions that came up or comments, suggestions?
Yep, this is Kristen. One comment is you probably need to coordinate with the school PT to determine the length of time allotted in this position. It's so amazing and an incredible way to allow students to explore their environment. And then another one is this a multi-way track? And wow, I wish more classrooms had the space for this.
That is an excellent point. It is called an H track, so it does go like horizontally and vertically. So she really can get around almost that entire space. And it's pretty amazing to see how she was able to kind of go back and find things. She was using trailing, not so much with her hands, but with her feet and maybe the backs of her hands and body. Just pretty interesting stuff. I have seen in some gymnasium environments where they do have at least a straight track. So we could have a starting point and an end point and have kids kind of do the same thing in traveling from the beginning to the end. Pretty neat stuff. So, but you are correct too. Before you enter any of this kind of stuff, it is very important to work with a physical therapist to see what the advice and limitations are. And usually physical therapists are very, very helpful in kind of orchestrating this type of an experience as well.
And this is Kristen, a comment, such a cool piece of equipment. And then SLP here, speech language pathologist, how would you promote communication literacy with either the little room or the H track?
Well, the exploration part of it will certainly help a child to build up concepts. So I think that's kind of a basic thing that you would get from having a child freely explore. There could be an adult who might enter the interaction once the child has had time to kind of just free flow it around, could start briefly labeling things, both sounds that are heard, shapes of things, the round thing that she went around, the square board, different things, because she actually was trailing around both of those, and it could be kind of curious what she was taking in about that. I did hear some verbalizations from her, not too much, but I think she was probably not real verbal maybe, and secondly, she was concentrating on what she was finding along the way. Oh, and I saw that last one about Penricton. And is that the last one, Kristen?
Yes.
I can go ahead and comment on that. Those of you who've had a chance to go to Penricton, and this type of a thing is just, it is amazing. They have whole big rooms that are open, and even their lunchroom, they have a place so that kids who are not ambulatory are able to move from place to place. And what a boon. As an O&M specialist, I was just amazed, and the possibilities there are huge. So yes, if you get a chance, go. It is in the Detroit area in Michigan. The ESF board, is there a weight limit? No, not to my knowledge, there would not be. Now, I suppose if you have a very, very heavy young person, that it would weight the springs down more. but I don't think there is any weight limit for that I know of. There might be a couple of different sizes that she sells. I can't recall that, but that may be possible so that you could buy a larger size if you have a larger child or individual using it. Did that address all of the chat questions and comments?
This is Kristen. Yes, it did.
Okay, thank you. All right, let's move on to the next section here, which is getting into the old routine. And this is kind of addressing routines, daily routines, which are meaningful applications of ways to build skills and to implement active learning, and then practical skills for daily needs. And it also meets early intervention requirements. The idea now is to really infuse things into your routines. First of all, it gives families a chance to practically implement these many times a day if you are implementing things during diaper time or bedtime or meal time or whatever. And it also does not require families to set aside a particular skill time. It just happens throughout the day during very practical times for the routines. So let's take a look at these. This is bedtime and then ready to change. What I'd like to do is to kind of look at if you think about these as you're looking at these, are what steps and strategies do you notice being used during these everyday routines? And in what ways can this approach foster a child's early exploration, communication, and literacy? And if you have any additional routine ideas beyond what we have time to do here, just talk a little bit about how you may have infused some of these things into some other types of routines. And just send that through with the chat. So let's go ahead and look at bedtime with Christopher.
Bedtime. How do you decide what's most important to include in a routine? First, ask the child's family how they do this routine at home. Christopher's mother developed a bedtime routine that included his favorite vanilla-scented ball. She tells him it's bedtime and then starts their little system.
Go to bed, and we tell him when it's time to change his diaper and whatnot. But he likes to play in bed. It's really the biggest thing. Wanna lie down? Wanna lie down? And we have a little system. We try to do things the same so he knows what's happening. It's covered first, and then we squeak the ball.
His mother squeaks the ball and waits for him to reach for it.
You want your ball? Night night. Go night night. What is that? Night night. Night night.
Christopher is expected to take an active part in this routine. His mother moves at a slow pace that allows him to respond by moving his hand to get the ball. Christopher's bedtime. 1. Pull up the covers. 2. Squeak the ball. 3. Wait for him to reach for it. 4. Say goodnight and kiss him goodnight. His bedtime routine grew. They added more accessible communication, one of the keys to a good routine. How do you decide where to start when building a routine? Choose a physical routine that happens several times a day. Add a child's preference, such as the scented ball. Build in communication based on what's most accessible to the child. Christopher has high myopia, CVI, and a moderate to severe hearing loss.
Okay, were there any comments from the group about that clip?
This is Kristen, not at this time.
Okay, all right. So I think, if you look at, mom basically came up with a really neat routine. If a parent is kind of struggling with that, we can certainly team up and come up with some ideas of what might be needed. But this mom kind of had it all figured out herself. And so this was a perfect time. As they talked about finding a routine bedtime, if they have naps during the day and then they go to bed at night, that's a time for several different things. Okay, the next one, let's kind of look at ready to change, a diapering routine.
Kay, one more thing.
Yes.
Someone said, I think it's important to differentiate the difference between receptive and expressive communication skills.
Yes, excellent. Do you want me to talk about that, or was that just a statement?
It seemed to be just a statement.
Okay, all right. Is everybody familiar with what expressive versus receptive is? Receptive communication, of course, is listening and taking in a message from someone else. Expressive is the ability to express something yourself. And so there are certainly two different things going on there. Okay. So ready to change.
Ready to change. How does a consistent routine prepare a child to be a more active learner?
Do you want to change your diaper? Do you want to change your diaper? Let's go get a diaper, okay? Go get a diaper. Oh, there they are. Yeah, give mommy a diaper. Good, you got a diaper. Ha, can you lay down? Sit down. Sit down. Sit down. Oh, you can just lay down that way. Okay. Yeah.
Joel's diaper routine. Use a touch cue and the spoken word diaper. Guide Joel to the diaper bag. Let Joel take out the diaper. Ask him to sit or lie down. How does a consistent routine prepare Joel to be a more active learner? When his parents use the same routine and the same words every time, he can begin to anticipate what's next. Knowing what's next helps him adjust to the change and not be startled by a sudden action. He can relax and enjoy the predictable repetition of their shared routine. The routine helps him learn where the diapers are kept, so he can start to build visual and spatial memory. Watch again. How many times does Joel's mom repeat the word diaper? Once he has the word diaper, how could they adapt his routine to expand his receptive vocabulary? Joel has cortical visual impairment and a moderate hearing loss.
Good grammar and spelling are important, but
Okay, are there any comments or questions or suggestions for that one?
No, there are not. This is Kristen.
Okay, all right. Then let's move on to literacy. And this one is the slide on all sorts of books. And certainly books are only one rather small aspect of literacy. But here are some illustrations of some book adaptations when we take a look at this literacy and deafblindness videotape. This one will go through kind of like when we went through the materials for active learning. This will go through several ideas. Also in Lap Time and Lullabies, there are many ideas too about adapting literacy experiences and books. But let's take a look first then at this videotape, Literacy and Deafblindness, which looks at a whole variety of quote unquote book options and adaptations.
That we hear all the time in school. And for deafblind children, the question becomes, what does literacy look like? Oftentimes, we need to make sure that the student has an opportunity to be with his peers and do reading activities or group activities, as well as sometimes he needs to do it individually. So here are a few ideas of the way to get the student to have the physical access to the information. He can use his strongest sensory channels, whether they're tactile or whether they're hearing or vision or movement. Also, this is an opportunity for the student to develop vocabulary and concepts. And so many times when we think about literacy, we think about reading the printed word or speaking the language. The reality is for many of our students, literacy will be in the form of pictures or objects or gestures or some other medium than what we normally use. Finding books for children with hearing and vision is very easy. You can find them anywhere. However, finding a book for a child who has both a vision and a hearing loss and possibly other disabilities is much more difficult, and so often is actually created by the family or someone who's working with the student. This is a simple book. All it did was take a texture or an object, matched it with the picture of the person, the important people in this child's life, such as Daddy and Mommy and his sister. And then part of a toy that represents the actual favorite toy of the child, such as Bongo Boy. And then also something important to him, such as being able to drink from his bottle. This is a simple book. Some of the ideas that I'm going to show you in the next few minutes are just simple things that you can do, but once again, they need to be tailored to the likes and dislikes of the child, and also tailored to their strongest sensory channel. This is just called a book box, okay? And it's not always just a book. It can be such as something like snack time or a recipe time. These are actually the utensils that the child will need to make the snack that he's going to make for that day. Or if it's a student in a home ec class, that these may be the items that the student's going to hand to another student or actually use to make a recipe. So it's a half a cup measure, it's a full tablespoon, it's a teaspoon. And one of the things you want to do is look at keeping those all together so that it's very easy for the student to then also go and find and get it for themselves. Once more, a move into independence. Another thing that's available is something like a book baggie. All this is a bunch of small baggies with zips, and they're stapled at the other end. And this one happened to be done for a high school student, and it's a grooming activity. So in the first page, and I use that word loosely, there's a toothbrush, and the student actually can use this for a grooming routine they have. And then in the next page, it's the toothpaste, and they can actually then open up that baggie to take the toothpaste out and then put it back in when they're done. Or this can be representative of the toothpaste that they have in the classroom. It doesn't have to be that they use this actual item. And then the same thing, a jar of hand lotion. So this is another way to do a baggie. I recently saw a teacher do some things with fruits, and she had all different fruits sliced up in each one of the bags. And what was really nice is the students could then smell it, as well as they could taste it, and it became a book. So they can be used in many different ways. Also, one of the other issues is trying to get a student to start to be even interested in books. And so this was a student who particularly liked things that would spin around. And so we actually created a picture of a car, and we attached some wheels from a broken toy, and so he could look at the picture. Now, was he interested in the picture? No, but he was interested in making the wheels turn. And so we started to turn it into a book with different wheels, and by the time you get to the end of the book, there's just the picture of the vehicle. This student is now actually looking at books, looking at pictures, and actually being able to select items and name items out of the book, but initially had no interest whatsoever in the concept of a book. Also, we have book bags, and in the book bag is the actual book that some of the students in the classroom are going to go ahead and read. What happens is in this book, it talks about the fact that the students, it's bubble time, and the fact that they use a yellow sponge and those things. Inside the bag are the actual items, so that the student can actually bring out those items. So the class may be reading the first page that talks about the actual shampoo, and the student goes ahead and finds the one that's shampoo. and brings it out. And they may pass it around the group of the kids if it's a very young class of students like this book is directed for. So that doesn't mean that the rest of your students don't have the opportunity to play with those items too, because they're there. They can actually even be involved in helping the student find the item out of the bag.
I hate
Also,
to, I
putting
hate to
things
cut
back
this
in.
off,
Constantly
but I'm
working
wondering
with
if
students who don't
maybe
have
we
vision.
could
and if
stop this
student-
one. And I believe you have access to the rest of this if you would like to know the other ideas. I just got the old hook saying we got 10 minutes to go. So I need to kind of see if we can at least present the last pieces in a modified form. But that is one way to kind of look at literacy and to adapt books. So if you look at that, and then the Lap Time and Lullabies also has it. So we're going to move on then to the next section, which is Speaking Up. And what I'd like to do is to just kind of show, this one is a little more vocalizing and emitting sounds and turn taking. If we could just take, this one is like a 1 minute long clip. It's the vocalizing with a microphone, and it includes the use of music, which again is a really important concept, I think, in grabbing kids' attention and adding to that whole communication piece. So would we be able to cue that one up, please? The vocalizing with the microphone, and we'll just watch that for a minute and get any reactions to that. These are ways to increase a child's vocalization.
Oral motor. A title reads, Oral Motor, using a metal bowl to imitate sounds.
Can we move to the vocalizing with the microphone one? Although this, okay, we'll go with this one, that's all right.
A title reads, Oral Motor, vocalizing with a microphone.
Rylan and Ashley are singing. Good singing, Rylan. Let's sing more. I'll sing a song and Rylan can sing along. We can sing a song together. Ah, 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 ah. Yeah.
Okay, all right, let's go ahead and at least you kind of have the idea of some ways of doing some very typical activities such as singing together. And this music therapist did a really nice job of waiting for him to respond and encouraging him to participate. We're going to have to just kind of sail through the rest of this. So let's go ahead and move to the comparables. And that's kind of our last, well, the whole body learning is the last section. I hate not to have that, but we may just need to do, let me just talk about comparables, and then I'm going to let you go ahead and view the video yourself, because the curler board that is here is from the Hold Everything booklet, and it is something that I kind of put together, which has different sizes of the prickly curlers on it, and they can nest in one another. They're different colors. Some have bells in them to make a sound. So that is a good example of a comparable board. And then the videotape, which I think we will just not do because of time, shows a child kind of playing with some balls in a metal pan. And the balls are all different sizes, different textures, different types. So he is basically exploring all balls, things that move like a ball, but are different in different ways. If we could go to the next section now, and again, I hate to rush through this, but we have about 5 minutes left, the whole body learning, because I think this is probably one of the more interesting things of ways that we can present lessons that are being taught in a different way. We'll have time for just part of this first videotape called the science lesson. It is 13 minutes long, but we'll just get enough so we can kind of get the idea. What this is the kids were learning about plants and how you plant plants and how they grow. And the little girl featured in this videotape, and I believe this was another Penricton Center one, wasn't participating in the traditional sense, but they translated into this. So let's just take a quick look at this before we have to end things for today. If we can do the science lesson video clip for at least a few minutes, please.
The science lesson. In a typical classroom setting, a teacher might have a lesson on the parts of a plant and the growth cycle from seeds to plants. This would take place usually in a small group activity where each student has only a brief time to examine the various materials with some amount of wait time as the teacher moves from one student to another. The teacher might show the student sunflower seeds, talk about what the seeds need to grow, such as soil, water, and sunlight. She might let them touch a few seeds, some dirt, and maybe water briefly as she goes from student to student. Students might plant the seeds with help from the teacher or aide and care for them. They might briefly examine the plants that emerge, remove some of the plants to discuss the various parts such as roots, stems, leaves, and petals. In this video, we will see how to take an active learning approach on the same topic. This activity takes place in a large room of Penricton Center. There are many other students engaged in activities around Kyra, our student, talking and making noise, which you will hear in the background. Kyra vocalizes several times during this session, but she is nonverbal for the most part. She is almost 7 years old at the time of this recording. She has retinopathy of prematurity, high myopia, optic nerve pallor in both eyes, and sees best in the left eye and inferior position. Kyra has had a swallow study that says she can eat regular bite-sized food and thin liquids. She has been diagnosed with spastic hemiplegia, cognitive impairments, microcephaly, and epilepsy. She has cerebral palsy, with her lower extremities more affected than her upper extremities. Kyra can roll over, sit for approximately 3 minutes on the floor or ESF board without support, but has poor balance skills. She does not walk independently. She likes to fall over and laughs when she does this. She has good head control. She also has poor safety awareness. When the video begins, Kyra is in a Hopsa dress on a track. Below her feet are a tub of sunflower seeds, a container with soil and pine cones, a tub of water with sponges floating in it, a bucket with a large hosta plant, and a tub of rocks.
In case I lose everyone, I don't know if we get cut off at noon, but I would like you to have a chance to see this if you can. But I also want to thank Kristen, Ann, and Kathy, and all of our interpreters for their hard work in putting this together. So if we have another minute, great. If we don't, please cue that up. The science lesson video clip that you were about ready to see that they kind of got winded about is a really good one.
And this is Kristen. Kay, the links are in the material, so I think, the opportunity won't be missed.
Great.
And I want to thank you for sharing such wonderful information about active learning and all of the resources that were shared today. I do want to let folks know that the CEU will be provided after you fill out the evaluation, and Anne is going to drop the link to the presentation evaluation into the chat. There are several folks that signed up that did not show up today, so we will not be sending the link for the evaluation to all the participants. We're only going to share it here in the chat. So please take note of that. And if anyone that's here needs it and can't retrieve it from the chat, please email me and I can email you that link. I also want to remind any O&Mers that need an ACV REP certificate to please email me now, and I will send you your certificate directly. And Anne, were you going to share the afternoon agenda? And if not, I will just talk you through the regional make and take groups. So for the afternoon, if you are in a make and take this afternoon, you can spend the time obviously having some lunch, eat some lunch. There is a bulleted list that should be in the Google folder for the afternoon. And Anne, we have those black boxes covering the agenda.
I don't know what's going on right now, so I'm just gonna need to hop out of this really quickly if I can.
Sure, but the afternoon agenda, you folks can just review the Tactile Bar Food for Thought resource that's in the Google folder. These are lists of ideas for you to use and talk about while you're making the toy bar. There's also a link to a tutorial on show you how to make the toy bar. And be talking and exchanging ideas about when, who, and how the tactile bars will be used with your students. And just we're hoping that you all can have good, rich team discussions about how to best serve these students. So thank you all so very much for coming. And Anne, are we forgetting anything?
No, I think we've got it all.
Okay.
Did you get?
And I don't know, Kay, are you available to answer whatever questions were in the chat?
Sure.
Okay.
Yes.
All right. So, Melissa asked if the recording will be put into the Drive folder, and I think it's in the PowerPoint, which is in the Drive folder. Got a lot of thank yous. Okay, if there aren't any other questions or concerns, I think we are. Oh, Melissa asked about the recording of this. Anne, will we be, after this recording is captioned, will it be going into that same Google folder?
I'm not sure yet. I think I need to upload it to the Minnesota Deafblind Project YouTube, and then from there I will share it into the folder. I think we
okay. And then once that link has been determined, maybe we can send it out to all the registered participants.
That sounds good. Yeah. So we will do that. It's going to take about a week. We need to have some time to download it, upload it, send it to get captioned, come back, upload it into the YouTube channel. So it won't be an immediate turnaround, just so you know.
Right. So thank you all again, and have fun making your toy bars.
There's one more.
Bye.
Oh, sorry, what?
Goodbye.
Bye, Kay.
All right, bye.
So the question in the chat is just to confirm the afternoon is at our own pace with our teams rather than another Zoom meeting. That is correct. There's no afternoon Zoom meeting. You'll all be together either in your regions or Zooming from regions directionally, but this Zoom room will close.